So today's lecture is on France, basically from about 1870, 71, the time when the Second Empire ends, and then moving forward to another republic. The first republic. I'm having a problem, coming up with what the first republic was. Um, can anybody go there with me? When is the first time that France has a republic instead of a monarchy? Oh yes, I remember. I remember that now. Which king? Yeah, the 16th Louis. So Louis the 16th, and if you remember, he didn't want to be a constitutional monarch, and that was problematic. Tried to flee France, et cetera, et cetera, and in the end gets his head chopped off. So that's the first republic. That goes through that goes through the terror and the directory and all that kind of thing. Second republic, because I know we had the first empire under Napoleon, and then we had a return to Kanman under Louis the 18th, and then we had a Kanman under Louis Charles the 10th. When do we get another republic? Thank you so much. Exactly. Yeah, during 1848 we get a second republic. We got the Tin Man and then the Five Man Executive, and then all that basically gets overthrown with a second empire of Napoleon III. Well, here's what you have going on in this Third Republic, 1871, till whenever this is going to end. You have a very serious left versus right split. You've got left-leaning people, kind of like the old pro-terror people in a way, versus the right-leaning people, the people who are, uh, you know, more conservative. I think that's just the right word. And that, as I said, that's a 70, 80 year kind of deal, if not going all the way back to 1789, so maybe a 200-year deal. And then also, just like everywhere at this point in time, you have increasing nationalism or increasing French identity that I'll tell you about as well. So you might remember me saying that the French really like to have a monarch. They feel comfortable with a monarch. Republics for them remind them for a long period of time of that first republic that turned into the terror. But over time, especially after Napoleon III, monarchists, people who wanted monarchy, kind of give way to people who are comfortable with a republic. After all, you can have, I think, a bigger influence as a voter in a republic than you do in a constitutional monarchy. There were lots of different political parties in France at this period of time. It's really kind of a modern democracy. There's a lot of elections that happen. There are a lot of changes in ministries. A new president is comes into power pretty frequently, and and unless you and I are experts in French history, we're not going to try to remember those people or those parties and so on. When they set up this new constitution post Napoleon III, they were fearful of having one strong leader, one executive, one president who could seize power like Napoleon III had done. He was president for a bit. He declared himself president for life and then emperor. And so they're frightened of that. For the most part, what you have is moderate Republicans. Now, once again, sometimes words don't mean the same thing. Like our early liberals in Britain in the early 1800s, for you and me, are like, sort of very conservative people who don't want to help people very much, if that's how you understand politics. These moderate Republicans are in favor of a republic, which would make them left leaning instead of, right wing people who would probably be more in favor of a monarchy. Everyone, I think, even going back to the 1860s, maybe 1850s, all the politicians start to realize how powerful it is to sway the masses. Those realpolitiker, if you think about all these isms that they're jumping into, they do this in order to influence public opinion, sway the masses, because at this point in time, people realize that the masses are important, the people are important. They engage the populace, or they try to make themselves popular with the populace by re-legalizing trade unions. You might remember that Napoleon III legalized unions back in the 1860s. When Napoleon leaves, or when he's gone, they make them illegal again. But if you wanna attract the working class, you have to kind of throw them a bone, allow them to organize, allow them to fight for higher wages, better working conditions, and that sort of thing. You could even, one step beyond that is legalizing strikes, which is a very powerful weapon of the working class. They also were trying to, I guess, so I could say that re-legalizing trade unions is sort of a realpolitik move for socialism in a way, allowing the lower classes to have something. A colonial empire is being sought as well. Parts of Indochina are being taken over. That would be like Vietnam for the most part. Bits and pieces of Africa. Like I said, we'll talk much more about that at the end of this unit. Who would they be attracting with trying to get a colonial empire? Can you imagine that? What kind of ism, what sort of ism is into seizing territory for the greatness of the nation? Certainly imperialism, but what about the isms that we talked about in the early 19th century? Yeah, nationalism. Yeah, it's a great nationalist move, and what's interesting is everybody can be a nationalist. Socialists can be a nationalist, and liberals can be a nationalist, and conservatives can be nationalists. Nationalism is kind of like that. Everywhere starts to force, not just offer, but to even force compulsory elementary education. Starting 1883, 1884, all French boys, all French girls start to go to school. Previously, it had been for the elite. Previously, it cost money. This is a big deal, and the reason why they do this, I think, is twofold. It's kind of the same reason that you go to school. One is for economic purposes, so that you are educated enough, or so that these French kids are educated enough to enter into a second industrial revolution kind of economy. But then the other bit is for civic purposes, so that people will be rational enough, so that they'll be educated enough to support the government, to support the Constitution, to support the state, and for those who can vote, support parties that go along with all that kind of stuff. And so uh, I think we might be kind of subtle about that when you're going to school, but there's things like saying the Pledge of Allegiance, for example. There's a whole bunch of other things that we could talk about, but there's just all kinds of different ways in which you are, and the kids back then were sort of educated into the system so that they wouldn't try to overthrow it. This French patriotic mindset has things like a female figure, Marianne, who represents France, and you find her all over the place. It's kind of like our Uncle Sam in a way. The tricolor flag, this three-colored flag, anthems, the Marseillaise anthem, and so on. You've got all of these kinds of things that make people more nationalistic, I guess. There's Marianne, the symbol of France. It's strange, and I can't really explain why there are different sort of like personalities, human beings who represent countries. There's also birds that represent countries for some reason. Oftentimes, those birds are eagles. Does anyone know what the bird of France is? Like the bird that represents France from time to time? Yeah, yeah. It's basically a rooster, right? And so, plucky rooster, plucky France. There are a couple of affairs I want to talk about today. There seem to be, I'm not sure why we call them affairs, events, situations, but anyway, in French history, they're called affairs. And they show us something about the left-right situation in France, and then they're just kind of interesting to talk about as well. This left right, this Republican versus conservative split, as I say, it goes all the way back to the French Revolution, where you had people on the left trying to kill people on the right, and then people on the right eventually having a kind of white terror against the people on the left. Napoleon comes along and just sort of smooths all that over by being a popular dictator. But from time to time, you see that rearing its ugly head again, where you have, after a king is overthrown, then the left says, oh, let's have a republic, and the right says, no, I think we should really have a king. Um, the Germans play a role in these two affairs. The French were absolutely mortified and humiliated by their loss in the Franco-Prussian War. They had always been beating up on the Germans and keeping the Germans divided. Think about the 30 Years' War, for example. And finally, the Germans are able to defeat the French by themselves, and that was a shocking loss for the French, and they're really mad about it. So it makes sense that the Germans play a role in these affairs. The first affair is called the Boulanger Affair, and it's late 1880s. We'll talk a little bit about radical political ideas like anarchism and syndicalism. Anarchists believe that the state and an organized government is simply responsible for all kinds of terrible things. The organization of a state is bad, and it needs to be overthrown. And they think that should be overthrown through terrorism, more or less. Some sort of great terroristic event can make the entire government tumble and create a whole new world where no one really needs a government. Everyone just will get along. The government divides people and makes them, the government is responsible for crime and poverty and all these sorts of things. It's anarchist belief. So there's a bunch of anarchist attacks that are going on in the 1880s Europe-wide, and in fact in the United States too. And arrests are made, and anti-anarchist demonstrations are made, and the economy too, in starting in 1873, as I'll repeat several times, starts to tank worldwide. There's a worldwide Great Depression in 1873. And then, of course, like I said, 1871, the Germans defeated the French in the Franco-Prussian War. They proclaimed their emperor in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. They stole Alsace-Lorraine away from the French and made the French pay 5 billion gold franc in reparations. So everybody hates the Germans and wants to get revenge on the Germans. The government too at this point in time is kind of corrupt. People feel like it doesn't care very much, and people start to look for another kind of Napoleon III figure, somebody who's going to restore glory to France and restore the elegance and all that kind of stuff to France. Make France, sorry for saying this, make France great again, and so there is a guy who starts to seem like he could be the person to restore France to greatness. His name is Georges Boulanger. That's him right there. He is a dashing general. He's a cavalry general, so he's oftentimes on horseback, and people on horseback just look better than people just standing around. And he looks like the strong man who could, get revenge on the Germans. And he says that he's very clear in that he's a very right-wing guy, and he has support. He wants to bring back a monarchy, but let's face it, he might be the monarch. And so monarchists, people who feel comfortable with the strong man, liked Boulanger. The nationalists really liked him as well, because he's promising greatness of France and promising revenge on the Germans. The urban poor liked him because he also says that they deserve a more fair economy, something that's gonna make them happy. And there's a lot of right-wing newspapers that start talking up this guy, and it seems like a coup d'etat is likely. Oftentimes there's these storming of the chamber that happens, or a Napoleon comes along and Napoleon, sends the parliament home and seizes power. It seems like that's about to happen. He seems to be talking about that, about doing that. And so the government's like, well, why are we sitting around waiting for this guy to march into the Chamber of Deputies and declare, that he's the new emperor? Why don't we try him for treason? So They write up an arrest warrant for him, and when he hears that he's about to be arrested for treason, he flees to Belgium and goes to the grave of his recently departed uh, love interest, and he shoots himself. He commits suicide at her grave. And so you can imagine all these right wing people who are super excited about Boulanger are thinking, oh, this is the guy who's going to seize power. He's our dude. He's our guy. He's gonna be the next. And then he just runs off and shoots himself. And you can imagine they were terribly disappointed by that. Here it looks like this. It's kind of the golden age of newspapers and journals and magazines that report on the news, and everybody's really excited to read about stuff. I guess it's the internet of the time. Questions or comments at this point? Yeah. Um, hmm, well, I could make a gander. I could make a guess at what percentage of the population is literate at this point in time. I'm going to say probably about 70%. So probably a lot of the peasants aren't as literate as the urban people are. But yeah, I'm probably guessing 60, 70%. And if you can look at a picture, that's pretty easy and that's kind of cool, like this. Um, but certainly within as they start to educate everybody in the 1880s, then people become much more literate, and those journals and so on become much more powerful. So that was kind of a blip of an affair. It riles up the left and it riles up the right, and then it sort of ends. This Dreyfus affair lasts for a really long period of time. You can see it lasts from 1894 to 1906. And this Dreyfus affair is something that divides France during that period of time and beyond. It's really quite striking. It's like people really believe what they believe, and they're not going to be swayed by the other side's arguments. So Alfred Dreyfus is a captain from Alsace, and he's Jewish. And he's part of the general staff. Everybody at this point in time has a general staff that plans wars. War planning is a very intricate kind of affair. They have these mobilization orders that are just really complicated. How to move the men around and move all the equipment around with trains and so on. Anyway, this guy is privy to all the biggest French military secrets. Um, the the French have spies in the German embassy at this point in time in Paris. The spy is actually just the cleaning lady who steals all of the German trash and then lets actual spies go through it, and or I guess the intelligence services go through it. Anyway, what they figure out is that there is somebody on the French general staff who's passing on military secrets to the Germans. And they look at the French general staff and they say, well, who's the spy? Oh, it's the Jewish guy, because Jewish people aren't really French. Oh, and oh my gosh, this guy's from Alsace as well. That's in Germany now as of 1871. So it's got to be this guy. So they arrest this guy. They don't have any evidence against him, and so they sort of manufacture some evidence against him, and the military court sentences him to spend the rest of his life on a terrible place on the coast of South America called Devil's Island. Well, the evidence that was forged against him, people started to look at and say, "Hey, this doesn't seem right." And then they start to say, "Oh, well, this evidence is clearly forged. What should we do? Should we retry him without the forged evidence? Should we set him free because he might be innocent, or should we just hush up the whole thing because, well, uh, if if it comes out that the French military, forged evidence against a citizen, it would damage the reputation of the French military. And we can't have the military's reputation being damaged. The military is really the only thing that's keeping France from being taken over by the Germans. Well, conservatives, the right, that would be people who are conservative and political Catholics, and people who are anti Semites, people who just hate Jews for whatever reason, and monarchists or royalists, people who support the idea of having a king again, and a lot of people from the army. They think that uh, that Dreyfus is just one guy, and even if he's innocent, they should just, let sleeping dogs lie, just let him live out the rest of his life in a horrible place because, like I said, you can't damage France's or the French army's honor. It'll hurt their ability to fight the Germans if need be. Whereas people on the left, the liberals, the radicals, the socialists, thought about, citizens' rights. Here's an innocent person who needs to be, exonerated or needs a fair trial. It's about justice, really. And the realist writer Émile Zola wrote a letter called J'accuse, which was published in newspapers, which accused the conservatives of, sort of sending this innocent man into to a horrible fate, and and that they did this on purpose, and that the right is basically kind of evil. Well, the conservatives sue him and find a conservative judge, and he's convicted of libel. He's convicted of telling lies about these people but in fact, he was telling the truth about those people. And so he has to flee France for a period of time to not be to not be imprisoned, I guess, for telling the truth about this whole situation. This Dreyfus affair is just dividing families and dividing France in a huge way. Over time, a military court or the military court's conviction is overturned, and Dreyfus is brought back from Devil's Island. He's pardoned. He gets his army commission back. They make him a major, and he's able to overcome this false charge and so on. Here's the crazy part about this story too. Soon after Dreyfus is arrested and convicted, sent away, there is another major on the general staff who his name is Esterházy, which is actually a Hungarian name, and this guy commits suicide. And it turns out that he was a gambling addict, and it turns out, I mean, everybody realizes right away, oh, this guy killed himself. How was he paying for all of this gambling? He was the mole, or he was the spy. But they didn't do much with that. France still remained very, very divided. So I think this shows us how anti-Semitic France is, and we'll talk a lot more about anti-Semitism coming up here in a bit. And it also shows us the depth of this left versus right split that just splits the nation. I'll pause for a second if you have any questions about all that. Okay. Well, we are going to get into Marxism and socialism and so on here in a bit, and I do want to tell you that pretty much everywhere, you might remember with the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, everywhere has a socialist movement or a communist movement or a Marxist movement, whatever you want to call that, that is either orthodox or reform. So I'm not super sure that you have to write all of this down. Just know that, and I'll repeat that. Socialism at this point in time, a movement for the lowest classes economically, and quite frankly, people who are following Marxism are divided between orthodox and reform socialists. The socialists in France were split, like the Germans are split, like the Russians are split, and so on. Two different groups of socialists. They're forced by a socialist international, like an international group of organization of socialists, to come together to create one socialist party. But I'll just keep mentioning that to you, that that socialists are divided. Here's kind of the question. Marx says that there's going to be a revolution and the bourgeoisie will be overthrown. And so true orthodox socialists are just waiting for that revolution to happen. Reform socialists like Jean Jaurès say, well, you know what? Democracy is allowing the working class to vote. So why don't we vote ourselves better conditions? Why don't we vote better conditions for the working class? Well, if you vote better conditions for the working class, then maybe the revolution never happens. But, reform guys say, well, maybe we could get socialism through the ballot box rather than socialism through revolution. Hopefully you understand that. And hopefully you didn't get too tied up in the different guys. Moving along? Okay. Well, the Republican government, because of these affairs, remember the majority of the governments that exist at this period of time are left-leaning Republicans. They start to look at the Catholic Church as a conservative bloc that they kind of want to reduce the power of. It's kind of like the French Revolution, if you think about it, with that civil constitution of the clergy. The left-leaning government was attacking the right-leaning church. And so between 1901 and 1905, the state stopped supporting the church. That, like I said, that goes all the way back to the civil constitution of the clergy, when the church's lands were taken and then the church clergy were paid by the state. That stops. The state stops paying clergy salaries, and they stopped paying for kids to go to Catholic school. When they first started education for everyone, about a third of the kids were going. Maybe I don't know that for sure. A large number of kids were going to Catholic schools, and the French government was paying for them to do that because they didn't have state schools. That would mean the creation of fewer state schools. But with these new laws, the Republic neither recognizes nor salaries nor subsidizes any religion. So they said, look, you have to go to a state school unless you want to pay for a Catholic school. So the payments to the Catholic schools, and about a third of the students left the Catholic schools. Now, tell me about that really quickly. We have Catholic schools and we have public schools, or we have private schools and public schools. Do you get why the government would want kids to go to a government school rather than a Catholic school? It's the same thing that I've been talking about really all throughout this class. What's the difference between a kid going to a Catholic school and the kid going to a government school or a public school? Yes, I like that. The emphasis of French. In the French school, in the French public school, you can get all kinds of patriotic kinds of stuff, as part of the curriculum, so that they come out supporting left-leaning governments or support the Republic and so on and so forth. In a Catholic school, what are you going to get a little bit of? Yeah, and to the Pope. That's the thought. I'm sure it's overblown, the thought, because I'm sure in Catholic schools then, or even in Catholic schools today, you walk into a public school, you've got the American flag. You walk into a Catholic school, you might have the papal flag in addition to the American flag. I think that's it. I think that there's just a little bit of a worry that, Catholic schools are creating these right-wing people who are going to maybe listen to the Pope or maybe not want to have, in some way, quite as much support for the Republican government. So, like I said, this left-right split remains until after World War II, and I'll explain why or how World War II kills that left-right split. So before World War I, as we move up through the early parts of the 19th century, France is looking to be a great power again. I think that Napoleon the First was the high point of their power, or Louis the XIV was the high point of their power. They want to be a great power again, and they do so by grabbing colonies all over the world. They're number two. They're the number two colonial power in the world at this point in time. I'm sure you can imagine who number one is. They are also at this point in time really paranoid about the Germans, and they're looking for a chance to get revenge on the Germans, get AL back. Who knows what AL is? Yeah, they want to get that territory back from the Germans. They want to have a successful war against the Germans. All of that stuff will sort of boost their nationalism, boost their morale once again, and everything will be okay. They also, though, are trying to win allies at this point in time, leading up to World War I, for support against Germany. And this is a period of time, as we'll see, that there's a shuffling of alliances, and they're able to get a couple of allies that will join them in World War One. And then, sadly, they still have this left-right split that's going on. Okay.